Hi, Paris Thalheimer here. This is part 4 of my 4-part series on identifying 1970s era Stratocasters. Now, in this video, I want to recap what I've kind of gone over, make sure I haven't missed anything, and kind of give my final thoughts on purchasing guitars as a whole, and educate people on how to go about doing that. Having said that, if you have not seen the first 3 videos, these are in order, and you might want to watch those first, otherwise this video might not be as helpful. Also, I'm not an expert on this subject, and I would never claim to be an expert. I will say I'm pretty knowledgeable on the subject. I've owned at least 5 or 6 1970s era Stratocasters. I generally know what I'm looking for. On occasion, I am surprised on some things that I did not know, and that's called learning. Now, having said all of that, if I have forgotten anything or I've made a mistake on any bit of information, well, I'm a human being and I make mistakes. But if you have any questions or comments or want to have any kind of conversation about Fender Stratocasters and Fender guitars on whole, please feel free to email me at parist1@hotmail.com. I'll gladly entertain any kind of questions on the subject, and any kind of input is always helpful. So let's begin by my final thoughts. Okay, so you went to the music store, you found on the wall a nice, beautiful, in mint condition 1977 Stratocaster, and you've decided this is the guitar I want that guitar. Stop. Stand back for a minute. Take a breath. Take out your phone. Go on the internet. Do a little research. Make sure you get what you think you're getting. Then play the guitar. Make sure it's really the guitar you want. I've played some very expensive guitars that I really didn't like. I've played some guitars that looked beautiful and played awful. Also, when you're talking with the seller and you're negotiating a price, a couple things. One, have them take apart the guitar, especially vintage instruments. Brand new instruments, not so much. But vintage instruments, there are things you're going to want to find and see under the hood, because this is 1970s era Stratocasters. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find something has been replaced or swapped out. Not everything is going to be original, and generally it's going to be in the electronics. Pots have been swapped out. Jacks have been swapped out. In fact, this guitar originally is supposed to have a 3-way switch, has a 5-way switch. To me, I don't care about this sort of stuff. To a hardcore buyer, this is important. They don't want to see any alterations. So, if you do make alterations to these guitars, make sure you let everybody know what you've done. You don't want to, be fraudulent when you're selling a guitar. Why be dishonest with people? For instance, when I bought this guitar at Action Music in Virginia, in the DC area, and right off the bat, the seller told me right from the beginning, this guitar has been altered, and the price reflected it. The neck had been flattened to a 12-inch radius, it had been refretted, and it was given a new nut. Overall, outside of that, the guitar was pretty much original. When I purchased this guitar, I knew the 5-way switch had been swapped out, or excuse me, the 3-way switch had been swapped out with a 5-way switch, and that it needed a new nut and new frets. Not a big deal. I don't mind changing out a few parts. Hold on to those parts, put them in the case, because someone may, if you do decide to sell the guitar, someone will want those parts. But overall, I generally don't care about minor changes like that. I will say that these things will alter the price in some fashion. Depends on who's buying it from you. Another thing, if the guitar, for instance, this guitar has a lot of wear and tear on it, on the paint job, do not refinish the guitar. This affects the price greatly. In my price guide, I think it said that it devalued the guitar by 50%, which is a lot for a guitar. So whatever you do, please do not refinish these guitars. Now, when you do get the guitar and you've purchased it and it's taken it home, the next thing I would suggest doing is take it to a qualified luthier. I use Phil Jacoby at Philtone, and he does good quality work. I always make sure that the frets are good and replace them if they need to be replaced. If it needs a new nut, I replace the nut. But generally speaking, if it needs work, it's worth getting fixed. You just spent a couple $1,000s on a guitar. Put the work into it. Now, as far as anything I might have forgotten, a couple things. One, you see that little notch right there? That notch is a manufacturing, kind of a defect. Fender did this in the 70s. You won't find this on brand new Stratocasters, and you certainly won't find it on very old Stratocasters. It's just something that happened at Fender during that time period, that these guitars from that time period have that little notch. Another thing that I had forgotten to mention about the rosewood fretboard, in about 63 or 64, somewhere thereabouts, Fender went from a slab board piece of rosewood, which basically meant that this neck was flat, and then they glued a big, thick, like solid piece of rosewood on top of the fretboard. But in the early 60s, they went to this laminate board. I don't know if you can see, but it's a thin piece of rosewood that has been glued on a curved neck. So again, early 60s, 60, 61, 62 rosewood fretboard is going to come as a solid slab. After that, it's going to be a thin veneer, and they curved the maple neck, and they took a piece of curved rosewood and they slapped it on there and glued it in place. And a lot of people don't like that. They say it affects the tone, and I personally haven't had any issues with it in any way. Doesn't bother me at all. So before I go, I want to give credit where credit is due, and I'm going to give information about some people and some places where I found some very good, valuable information, where I've gained all the information based on in these videos. Any photos or any guitars you've seen in these videos have been mine, or guitars that I have purchased and then sold later on. So for the first place is Strat Central. You can type in Strat Central and it'll come up and in your search engine, and it's a great place to find all sorts of information about vintage Fender instruments. And you can find that at www.strat-central.com /70s strat /. Good place for information. Another thing is the Fender book by Tony Bacon and Paul Day, great writers, have written extensively on guitars. The Stratocaster Chronicles by Tom Wheeler. Tom Wheeler is one of the most knowledgeable, well-written, he is a great writer. He has written some great books on Fender, very knowledgeable, and I highly recommend you look up anything he's written on these. He does some really good quality work when it comes to writing about Fender guitars. Okay, Fender, The Golden Age, from 1946 to 1970, by Martin Kelly, Terry Foster, and Paul Kelly. And this is a book which covers Fender from its very beginnings all the way up to 1970s. There's a lot of great reference material there. There's a lot of great photos and background information about Fender guitars. Another place where I get information from is the official vintage guitar price guide. This comes out annually. It's not cheap. Sometimes you might find it in the library, but overall you're going to find it in like Barnes and Noble and someplace like that. It's kind of hard to come by as far as like bookstores. Not every place is going to stock it. This is by Alan Greenwood and Gil Hembry, and has some really good pricing information about how much you should expect to pay or how much you might want to sell these guitars for. And it talks about condition and things like that. I want to thank Phil Jacoby at Philtone Guitars. He's a reputable luthier that I highly recommend out of the Baltimore area. You can also go to Larry at Wooden Wizards. He's out of Virginia in the DC area. He's also a good quality luthier I highly recommend. And if I hadn't said this earlier, I will say, when you do get your guitar worked on, please go to a good luthier. The big chain stores are great for buying instruments. You get some good deals. They're great for getting a guitar set up, but I would not take my vintage instrument to one of the big chain stores. And my reason for that is, though they mean well, they don't have the experience, the tools, or the time to really put in the effort to do work on vintage guitars. Because my own personal experience, if you screw up a fretboard when you get it refretted, the luthier you do take it to is going to be very angry with you when he has to fix or unscrew what somebody else screwed up. So take your vintage instrument to a good quality luthier. It'll save you money in the long run. Well, that's about all I have to say on this subject. Until next time, keep on playing.